This conference will now be recorded.
Just go ahead and announce it to everybody.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar today. Thank you all so much for joining. And really the reason that we're hosting this webinar today is to let you all know what our next steps are for the hashtag Protect Maldives Seagrass campaign. If we have any people on the call who are our partners or from resorts who are our partners or organisations, we just want to say a huge thank you to you for making it happen, because without your support, we wouldn't have been able to have been so successful with the campaign. So today, today we're just going to run through a few different things. I don't know if any of you saw any of the press releases or the outcome of the campaign. I think our biggest success was that the campaign was endorsed by the Maldives Ministry of Tourism. That for us was a huge success, mainly because I'm not sure if any of you saw the guidelines that were put out, but it was in fact the Ministry of Tourism that were advising resorts to remove seagrass. So to really have turned that around was a huge thing for us. I think the key thing is we got more than a quarter of all resorts across the Maldives to pledge to protect their seagrass, which is an astounding achievement, which we're really proud of. So now that we have these pledges, I think, as I said before, what we really want to do is make sure that this translates into effective conservation of seagrass, which was the entire purpose of our campaign. We have met with the Environment Ministry and we are in discussion with them, as we would really like them to start taking a leading role in collecting national data across the country. But in order to do that, we need all of you, the resorts who have pledged to protect their seagrass, to collect this data and to send it somewhere. So what we're really trying to set up is a kind of national accounting system for seagrass, and that's really where we need your help. We are also in discussion about hosting a workshop later this year with some experts from Australian universities who will be training the government and hopefully some of you guys as well on how best to monitor your seagrass and record the data. But that's not confirmed yet, and we'll be in touch with you to let you know when that happens. But for the moment, I'll pass you on to the Six Senses marine biologists who will let you know how they've managed to do this on site here.
Hi everyone, so my name's Pip and I'm the research coordinator here, and we have just been spending the last few months putting together a seagrass report. So some of the stuff I will go through is why we need to monitor, with it briefly mentioned, and then I'll go through some of our methods and what we found out, and hopefully this can be comparable across the Maldives as we move forward. So for monitoring, obviously, we can't understand the changes that are happening if we don't know what it was like in the first place. So often monitoring begins to happen when a change occurs, and then you try and retrospectively figure out what happens. But if we all start monitoring exactly what species there are, what size our seagrasses are, what's going on now before any of these changes occur, then we definitely have like solid knowledge of what it was like before and what it can be like after and as changes occur. And because of that also, seagrass can be a powerful bioindicator. So a lot of the talk around seagrass, especially in Maldives, is associated with excess nutrients, often associated with sewage outlet. But because we don't have these baselines beforehand, we don't really have a solid confirmation of what is causing this. And as a result, it can be a really good indicator if anything is happening with human impacts because of construction or any of these nutrients. And then our final aim, Viv mentioned briefly before, is that we would have a monitoring in various locations throughout Maldives. And resorts are the perfect place to set up these kind of things. Most resorts have a marine biologist, which means we already have skilled personnel there. And also it's not that complicated and it's not that hard. It can be done with even just one person, even if it's a small team. So I'll go through now a little bit what we already know about seagrass in Maldives from publications. So there's actually only 2 studies that we could find. There might be more from our searches. There's only these 2 came up. And for a country that is mostly reef and intertidal zones, coastal zones, this is very, very little. One is a investigation into nutrient output from fishing villages, like excess waste from fishing going into the ocean. looking at whether seagrass explains the distribution of this waste and the nutrients there. And the second one was in Bar Atoll, which was a kind of inventory, a survey of the algae and seagrass there. So there's not all that much, and in these two studies, only 3 different species of seagrass were described. So the best place we have to compare this to is the Lakshadweep Islands. If you don't know where these are, they're just to the north of Maldives. I think they're still about 300 or 500 kilometers away, so not that close, but it is the best comparison we have to the Maldives archipelago, is these islands. And here they found 8 different species, so that's a lot more than we have in Maldives. And this is a really nice study that looks at the distribution and the biology of seagrass. So this is something that we could really do in Maldives. And it would shed a lot of light on what seagrass is here. So because of this, we decided to do a study at our resort here, Six Senses Lamu. In case you don't know where we are south. We're still north of the equator. We're not really far south. And Six Senses, you can see, is in the south of the atoll near a really big channel just there. So the main objectives of our study were to map the extent, so we can map the changes over time, establish the species diversity in the seagrass, because we really think that there was more than just these 3 species, and also describe the meadow characteristics. So we're talking about things like density, epiphyte cover, and other things we could check for changes over time. So for extent, this is actually what we ended up finding. This is a map that we put together. In total, we found that there was 93,961 meters squared of seagrass, which is a lot higher than we originally estimated. How we did this was we actually used a drone to do a composite photo image. This gave us higher resolution images that we could then stitch together, and then we imported it into QGIS for analysis. I understand not everywhere would have drones, but actually doing it on Google Earth and drawing a polygon is just as easy. So you can just select the polygon tool, and then as long as the image of where your resort is fairly up to date and there's not clouds covering it or anything on your Google Earth, the desktop version, Google Earth Pro, will just automatically calculate the perimeter you can see in the window there once you select it. So that's a really, really simple and easy way to map the outline. But then, of course, you need to do some ground truthing. I realize I wrote ground troughing there. Sorry, guys. But you can notice all of the dark patches to the north of the island there. Originally, we thought that might be seagrass. But if I flick back to the previous one, only some of the patches were actually seagrass. So we just snorkeled around, ground truth with the GPS, and then we could trace it more accurately. So now we can move on to species diversity. So these are the 3 species that were found in previous studies. I'm not going to say all of their names, but we normally refer to them just as SI, TH, and TC. Sometimes I use the full name. And then these are the species that we found here, including the 3 that were already there. So we actually found 6 species, 3 of which had not been described in Maldives before, which is absolutely amazing because we only use the study area of our lagoon around our resort, and I just love to think about how many different species could be out there spread from north to south of Maldives. It could be many. If we compare that to the Lakshadweep species, these are the ones that were described there. Oh no, these are the ones, sorry, we have here. And in Lakshadweep, instead of Halophila ovalis, they had Halophila decipiens. It's very similar, but it actually has little hairs on the leaf, and it's a deep water seagrass. So we found some deep water seagrass meadows also in Lamu, but it was actually ovalis there. We thought it was decipiens, but once we got it under the microscope, we couldn't find any of the hairs, so we couldn't say for sure it's decipiens, but I'm sure that it's out there somewhere. And then another one that was actually the main species in Lakshadweep, which was the dominant species, was Somadosia cerulata. And this one looks quite similar to Somadosia rotundata at the top there, but it has little serrated edges around the leaf. So I'll go a little bit more into some species identification that we've noticed a few issues with sometimes. So one is the Halophila decipiens. If once you find those hairs, you know it's that one. But also, this is actually an image of Thalassodendron ciliatum, which has a really, really thick stem, which is just this one here, has a really long, thick stem. And that's really the characteristic of this seagrass, but it also has these serrated edges. So we've noticed a few times it had been mistaken for serralata. And then another one, if you look at the top, Thalassia hemprici, its characteristic is kind of a curved leaf, but also a rounded edge. But sometimes it can be really long and straight and quite luscious, but it does have these little red flecks, and it doesn't always have the red flecks, but if you see the red flecks, then it's definitely hemprici. So these are some things that we've learned along the way to just refine our species identification. So moving on from species, our meadow characterization. So the methods we decided to go with are the standard Seagrass Watch methods. And that is because of the sheer volume of resources available on the Seagrass Watch website. It's basically a 50 by 50 meter plot, as you can see by the diagram, and it consists of 3 50-meter transects. So instead of characterizing the meadow, this is actually looking at the seabed area. And it might be that some of the quadrats along the transects don't actually have seagrass in, and then you would measure the seagrass growth by them slowly filling up those quadrats over time. So we chose to do this so we can also submit the data to Seagrass Watch. So we're part of the national and worldwide database that is Seagrass Watch. But for the purpose of meadow characterization, you could actually discount those empty quadrats for your own analysis, and then it would just give the characterization of the meadow itself rather than the whole of that seabed area. So we found it was quite easy with 2 people. One person was taking the GPS of each of the quadrats and the transect line and taking a photo, and the second person was doing all the data collection. However, if you have really large meadows, it might not be the best idea just to do a 50 by 50 meter area. So we've just started looking at some surveys of much larger seagrass meadows. And in order to characterize them, the best method that we've been recommended is these random clusters of quadrats. So make sure there's like enough space between the quadrat clusters to make sure that they're different enough from each other, and then just place them randomly throughout the meadow. But the collection within the quadrat would be exactly the same as what your data you're collecting from the transect quadrats. Therefore, it is quite comparable if you get like an average percentage cover or an average epiphyte load or anything like that. So depending on what kind of questions you're trying to ask, how big your meadow is, maybe it's really tiny, maybe it's really big, you can choose different sampling methods, but these are the 2 that we would recommend. But of course, we can discuss any other methods that you find suitable. So this is the Seagrass Watch website. This is briefly where you can find all the materials. So if you look at the methods tab along the top, just under the banner, you've got all the manuals, the field guides, and the data sheets. And it pretty much explains everything there. That's another reason I just chose it. Everything's there, set, ready to go. So what we're looking at actually within the quadrats, this is an example of the data sheet. So the sediment type we look at, whether it's sand, mud, or shells or rubble. Comments in there could be if you want to study anything additional to what Seagrass Watch look at. So for example, if you want to see if there's any of a particular type of sea urchin or something else you want to study. Whether you took a photo, the percentage cover of the seagrass within the quadrat, the percentage species composition. So this will always add up to 100%, whereas the seagrass coverage would be whatever the percentage is in the quadrat. The canopy height, we've been taking 3 different canopy heights and taking an average of them within the quadrat, or you could just take one. And then algae cover is percentage of the whole quadrat covered in algae, and epiphyte cover is percentage of the seagrass in the quadrat that has epiphyte cover on it. So if we just look at an example for that, the Seagrass Watch has these percentage cover standards guides. So you can see on the left-hand side, the 5, the 10, 20, 35, etc. And this is one of the quadrats we took from our seagrass meadow. From that, I'd probably guess it's a little less than 70, but more than 50, so maybe 60 would be there. And then I can see from here that it has a mixture of species. It has SI and probably Pinophilia mixed in it, and it looks roughly equal. But sometimes you really have to get your fingers in there, and you really have to rustle around because it might be different species. As you can see from this picture, the main leaf coming up on the left-hand side has the red flecks. That's probably Thalassia hemprici, but then you can also see some SI in there. So be really thorough with your percentage species composition, because it might be really mixed. So moving on to density. So this is our percentage cover. These are the results we had from all of those quadrats. You can see these little lines, the GPS points of all of the transects we did. And the dark red represents 100% cover and the white represents 0, and then it's graduated in between. Interesting things we found from this was that we kind of assumed that the center of the meadow would maybe be where it started and therefore the most dense, but this isn't actually the case. You can see that sometimes the edges is more dense, and there's a few dense patches in the middle followed by other patches. So this is really interesting, and really can't wait to track this across time and see if it becomes more dense or if it just spreads out, something like that. And then this is our species composition, and you can also see that it's fairly varied and mixed. In some of the meadows, there's a more dominant species, but if you look at the meadow, for example, bottom right, it's really jumbled, and you can see there's a few different patches of other species as we go through. And as again, when we do this next time round, it will be really interesting to see how it's changed, or if it doesn't change, or anything like that as we go on. So the results from additional results, our epiphyte cover was generally quite high, but again, we can't say if that is a seasonal thing or if anything's changed, as this is the first baseline report we've done here. Algae cover was really variable. In some patches it was really clustered, in some patches we had none at all. Could be to do with currents, could be to do with sunlight, or it could just be a characteristic of that meadow. And as this baseline report, now we can observe seasonal changes. We'll probably do it biannually, so every 6 months, once in each monsoon season. And we can now hopefully compare it to other places in Maldives if they use exactly the same methods. So writing up reports with things like species diversity of the meadow, the density, and we can compare if all the meadows are similar, or if maybe the outside reef or the inside reef or near a channel is similar or different, etc. So really what we're calling for collectively, as all of the marine biologists in the resorts, we can really get a better idea of the seagrass meadows throughout the whole of Maldives. And another way we can collectively do together, just going to mention, is Seagrass Spotter. We've been browsing this for quite a while now. You basically just take a picture of a seagrass species, you identify it, and you put a mark on the map where it is. So we filled these out for some of the areas in Lamu, and we've looked at a lot of other areas in Maldives. Some of them have species that haven't been described that we found or in papers, but some of them are also misidentified. So if you go onto Seagrass Spotter, you take a picture, try and identify it, and we can also use the Protect Maldives Seagrass Facebook group to share some of these images and help each other identify different seagrass. It will be so exciting if we can find species that haven't been found here before. And I think there would be at least 8, if not more, so similar to the Luxury Group Islands. And Seagrass Spotter is also something you can get your guests involved in, which leads me on to Shelley, who's right next to me, and I'll hand over to her.
Hello everyone, so I'm just going to share with you some stuff around guest education on seagrass at your resort. So seagrass in the Maldives, as we are all aware, has got not the best of a reputation. So as a resort, we constantly live in the fear of that negative TripAdvisor review and what that will do for guests wanting to come back to the resort. But also as eco-conscious resorts, we're also looking for ways to try to protect the marine environment. So really the way to get into this is to change that perception of seagrass, starting with our guests. So we've created here our Seagrass Education Pack. So if you go on to the Protect Maldives Seagrass website hosted by the Resilient Reefs Project, you'll see a selection of the education materials that have been created. So you'll see here there's a Seagrass Education presentation, a way to identify the seagrass for your guests, as well as just what the species are that we have found in the Maldives. There's a more comprehensive education pack that was sent out as a Google Drive link. So if you haven't gotten that yet, or if you have misplaced it, please let us know so that we can resend that, so that you can try to get more guest engagement with seagrass at your resort. So all of these materials are really created with the idea that you can customize this to work for your resort, and they operate on different levels of engagement. So whether or not you want to just raise awareness for seagrass at your resort, or if you want to really start promoting that message of the importance of seagrass and getting guests actively involved in seagrass. So just some examples of some of the materials that you can use for that raising awareness option. Something as simple as sticking out a sign at your overwater jetties where they lead to seagrass, or somewhere prominent that announces that at this resort we have seagrass and this is why. Why is seagrass so important? So it really gets that into the forefront of your guests' minds right from the very beginning. Or the other option as well is having posters out about the Protect Maldives Seagrass campaign that you can have stationed around the resort. And as you'll see, there's highlighted in red there, a way for you to personalize that for your resort. So this is again something that you can really tailor to match the needs of your resort. It's not a one size fits all kind of pack. And so this is that really trying to just raise awareness. Alternatively, you can start doing things like presentations in your evening slots or whenever it is that you run presentations at the resort. Raising the awareness for seagrass. Why is it important? What does it do? What is the status? And also, what is it that you at the resort are doing for seagrass awareness in the Maldives? To the left, you'll see a photo that we've taken of an activity that we run with the children here. So that's a blank canvas bag to begin with. Following on from a little seagrass presentation we give, they can create their own little seagrass ecosystem, put it with little animals inside, and get them thinking about why it is seagrass is important. So the template for the presentation, the templates for creating these little wooden cutouts, as well as a write-up for how to run the activity, all exist inside this guest pack. So these are all those ways of raising just that awareness. But if you wanted to go that next level and really start trying to engage with your guests in seagrass at the resort, one of the best ways we found here is actually taking them out in the seagrass, showing them the stems, the roots, and the animals that live there. So there's a guide in the pack that's got a little flip book that you can again customize to fit with what animals are found in the seagrass meadows around your resort, as well as how much seagrass you have. And so this is one of those really, really great ways to get the guests out there and getting them inspired and passionate about seagrass. It's not just a black blob from the surface, it's something they can go out and explore and can really get some positive engagement, especially with the charismatic megafauna. We also encourage the guests here to let us know about any of the animals they see in the seagrass. So this is just a little citizen science survey that they can do, helping them to figure out what is what in the seagrass and then letting you know what they've seen, which you can then use to support your megafauna studies or to help promote seagrass. And so what we've actually found is that we have been getting super positive reviews from our guests related to the seagrass. So these are just a few of the reviews we've had on TripAdvisor that mention seagrass by name. And so I won't go through every single one of them, but just to highlight some of the things there. We've got guests that are recommending people to stay in certain jetties because they have easy access to seagrass. We have repeat guests coming and saying, oh, the last time I came there wasn't seagrass, now there is, and that means I've been able to see this, this, and this across my stay. And really we're seeing that we're getting some more of the environmentally conscious guests that are bringing in their reviews and getting that message for seagrass out there as well. Of course, there's not all, we have had one comment since our campaign has started around the seagrass at the resort. And this is something that every resort will have to deal with in its own way should they come up against such comments. This one here is from a previous guest we've had where they experienced going into the water where they didn't quite like the seagrass touching them or were concerned with getting into accessing the ocean from their villa because they couldn't see the bottom. So our approach to this was to actually go out in our seagrass again and take a closer look at how close the seagrass was to our villas. Make a list of those, and that's now a tool that we have given to our reservations team so that at the point of booking, they can use seagrass as a celebration. So, oh, you're staying on a jetty villa, means you have great access to seagrass, where we're going to have things like turtles, rays, etc. coming past. And for all of these reviews we've gotten that have mentioned seagrass, we've gotten just as many, if not more, that reference the jetties and the marine life that come in and around there. So it's not even just about getting the seagrass mentioned, but that positive experiences with the megafauna that a lot of guests are coming here to see. They all want to have that green turtle encounter, whether it's in the seagrass or just in the sea. And so one of the things I would really, really like to encourage, and it's something that Viv mentioned at the beginning, is to create this network where we can share these experiences. So as I said, this was something that we use, this is the way we combated that when we came up against it. But if you use any of the materials in the education pack, or if you have something that you're coming up against, share it in that Facebook group that we've started for the organisations and the resorts that are partners, so that we can all work together and we can really get this positive change for seagrass in the Maldives.
Thanks, Shelley. So at this point, we're done talking. And if you have any questions, you can just type them into the chat box. We've already had one question come up, which says, any experience or evidence of it helping on beach erosion control? I'm looking for a business case for resorts. So that is a really interesting question, because we have a few more studies that we're going to set up here, and one of them is specifically looking at sediment dynamics within and without seagrass. We have an expert visiting us just for 4 days called Paul Kunch, and he has spent many years in Maldives. He's working mostly on local islands, looking at helping them combat beach erosion there. But he's worked in a few resorts as well, and he's come here to really help us set up some studies that look at the like sediment pathways, whether we've got a net loss, a net gain, and really advise the erosion mitigation methods better, rather than these kind of haphazard methods that tend to go on. So as of yet, we don't have any specific evidence for it. But in the global aspect, there has been evidence that it definitely traps sediment, it definitely reduces wave action. But we hope that we have a specific example from a resort in Maldives, maybe by the end of this year, that we can share with everyone, maybe beginning of next year, depending, because I think some of these studies take maybe a full year or a good 6 months to get some really solid results. Just to mention some other studies that we're thinking that we're doing. One is we're looking at turtle grazing pressure in our seagrass. We're going to put in some exclusion cages and measure the seagrass within and without the cages, and we can see exactly what biomass of seagrass the turtles are eating. And then we're also going to look at some blue carbon and take some carbon cores and see how much carbon can be offset by your seagrass meadows between different species. So especially relevant to resorts because guests are all flying here a really long distance. And if we can put a value on how much carbon could be offset by the seagrass at your resort, it could be a really, really interesting, not only a marketing tool, but it could help us feel a lot better about our own carbon emissions too.
And just to add to that, that's something that we're in conversation with the Ministry of Environment about, because they have plans to, they're looking at sort of assessing how much sort of blue carbon there is in the Maldives, but I think at the moment they're focusing on mangroves. So we did have a meeting with them recently to suggest that, you know, they take on a leading role in kind of making sure that they're collecting data from all of these resorts. That really slots into to their national kind of goals and what they're setting out to do.
Does anyone have any other questions while we're here? Just type into the chat box if you do. No? Okay. Well, I think that's all for us. We did record this webinar, so if you want to share it with anyone, and we'll definitely share it around our partner resorts who haven't been able to join us today. But thank you all for logging on and listening to us. Hopefully you've been inspired to go and monitor your seagrass or nearby seagrass if you haven't done already. And thanks again for joining us.